The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one, the mouse ran down. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck two, and down he flew. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck three, and down he flew. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck four, he hit the floor. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck five, and down he died. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one, the mouse ran down. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one, the mouse ran down. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck two, and down he flew. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck three, and down he flew. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck four, he hit the floor. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck five, and down he died. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one, the mouse ran down. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck one, the mouse ran down. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck two, and down he flew. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock. The mouse ran up the clock. The clock struck three, and down he flew. Hickory dickory dock. Hickory dickory dock.
This is Tim Snyder. I wanted to say another word about fascism. It's 19th of October, still in Cincinnati, inside a piece of art called Dome of Reflection. Behind me over my shoulder is the statue of Lincoln. Not sure if you can see it. I'm going through the Midwest, and while I'm doing this, instead of writing much, I'm going to just share a few reflections on things that come up. And a thing that came up yesterday was fascism, and I heard some folks who were asking, well, can fascism be American? And that was meant in a couple different ways. One way was, has there ever been any history of fascism in this country? And the other way was, well, but we're different from those Europeans. So I just want to say a word about that. First, what is fascism? It's always hard to say, because the fascists are the people who tell the big lies. The fascists are the people who are in favor of impulse and will over reason and thought. And so they never define themselves, and you always find yourself kind of drawing circles around them, trying to define them. But for me, fascism would basically mean precisely that. It's a cult of will over reason. It's life inside a big lie. It's a transformation of politics into a cult of a leader who tells a big lie and who is able to establish himself as the person whose will should dominate everybody else's will. Okay, so that said, what about fascism in America? Well, first of all, it's obvious you can have fascism in America. If you just look around, there are people who are fascists. There are even people who call themselves fascists. The only slightly tricky thing now in the 21st century is this phenomenon where actual fascists call other people fascists. This started in Russia, it's now continuing in the US with Trump and Vance. But the fact that you call somebody else a fascist doesn't mean that you're not a fascist. If anything, it's part of emotion over reason. It's part of your big lie. Historically speaking, of course, there has also been fascism in this country. If you think about the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, 1950s, you can think of America as having escaped fascism. You can think of the combat in the Second World War plus FDR's set of reforms as a kind of anti-fascist moment in the United States, which put aside, at least for a while, a very real threat of a kind of isolationist fascism in the US. Now, two important points come out of that. The first is that even at our best, so to speak, even during the New Deal, Americans were deliberately excluding African Americans and immigrants from some of those wonderful policies. And that tendency to keep excluding in one way or another continues throughout the century. It's like a thread through the 20th century. So when welfare policies were extended to African Americans, when African Americans finally get the vote, then we shift over to voter suppression, and then we shift over to mass incarceration. There's always something, right? There's always something. So, and the second interesting point, which comes out of the 1920s, 1930s, 1940s, is isolationism. So America First was a pro-fascist movement inside the United States. And what America First was essentially about was protecting the white people from the onslaught of the browns and the black people. Lindbergh made that very clear. But note, what Lindbergh did was to say, we should be on the side of the fascist aggressor. We should be on the side of Hitler. What Hitler is doing is basically sound. We don't have to do anything because Hitler's doing the work for us. And you should note just how very similar this is to Trump's position on Putin. Trump actually uses the phrase America First, and has used it for a while. And when he looks at the great conflict in Europe today, what he says is, it's Ukraine's fault. The Ukrainians shouldn't have allowed this war to happen. They should have given up. And he never criticizes Putin, who is clearly a fascist and is in charge of a regime which is committing war crime after war crime after war crime in a horrifying war of atrocity. So a second kind of through line is that kind of isolationist, we're in favor of the stronger fascist stance, which you see in the US in the 1930s and you see in the US again in the 2020s. So if you think it can't happen here, the first thing to say is it is happening. There are folks around who would very much like for it to happen. The second thing to note is that it has happened here. And, I should refer now to, if you want to read more about this, wonderful work by Sarah Churchwell, new book by Rachel Maddow, also Heather Cox Richardson has done some fantastic work about this. But it has happened here. We just have never actually slipped over to the point where we had a fascist regime, but that doesn't make us special. And this is the third point, and this is maybe the most important point. If you think we're special, and that means we can't be fascists, that's really inviting fascism to the door. Because if you think we can't be fascist because we're so special somehow, that means that you're not going to see the signs, you're going to ignore the signs. And then when it's upon you, you'll make the following move. You'll say, well, okay, it is fascism, but it's American fascism, and therefore it's okay. In other words, if what you're saying now is, we can't have fascism because we're exceptional, what you'll be saying the next time around is, well, yeah, it's fascism, but it's ours, and therefore it's exceptional. Thank you very much. Again, this is Tim Snyder. It's the 19th of October. I'm in Cincinnati, Ohio, and I'm releasing these videos on my Substack as I go through the Midwest. Thanks for being with me.